Thank you, Senator Rono. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Frost, Mr. Dupree, I really enjoyed both of your testimonies, and I thought they were speaking to the importance of trying to find balance. The Supreme Court is probably one of the most important parts of our government, and its independence to rule is critical. And I appreciated Mr. Dupree injecting some skepticism about how anything that we do, if it can be exploited by this very political institution called Congress, is somewhat problematic and something that I would tread on very lightly. And I enjoyed both of your testimonies for that reason. Professor Frost, can I just ask you that there are some legitimate concerns, I think, that Mr. Dupree brought up. And I wonder if you could just talk to me this balance between separation of powers and checks and balances, which you spoke to so eloquently, is really what I'm looking at myself. There's been, unsurprisingly, a lot of political talk today in this hearing, but at the end of the day, I think America wants their Supreme Court. Something I learned at Yale Law School, if I learned anything, there was this idea of the appearance of impropriety and how problematic that is for a lawyer, not to mention the highest court in the land. And as was said in some of the early writings, is that the Supreme Court has no army. It vests its power in the consent of the governed. And these are very fundamental ideals. And I'm just wondering if you could help me with that balance.
Yes, and thank you for the question. So I hear Mr. Dupree's concern that we would not want ethics rules to be used as some way in which to penalize justices for their decisions. And in fact, I started my testimony by saying decisional independence is vital. But I actually think it's the absence of ethics rules that is harming the courts and leading to the problems we see today in terms of public perception. If ethics laws were strengthened or passed by this Congress, they would apply to all the justices. If there was more transparency in the court and its process for dealing with ethical problems, then we wouldn't have certain reporters publicizing certain justices' problems. We'd have transparency about each and every justice, whether they were abiding by the rules and what should happen next. So I think it's the absence of laws that is leading to the problem of political attacks on justices. If we had better legislation, we'd see less of that.
And what about concerns you would have when we enter into this space that is not something we regularly do in writing this legislation? What are some of the reasonable concerns that you would have about how that legislation is narrowly tailored to the end that we are looking for?
Well, so first, and I think this is in the proposed legislation, it would be best for the Supreme Court itself to draft a code of conduct for itself. I agree with others on this panel who have said that the code of conduct for the lower courts, which the Supreme Court says it follows or uses as guidance, it maybe needs to be tweaked or changed in various ways to deal with the unique nature of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court itself should come up with a code that it drafts for itself, but legislation could tell the court, you must do this now, because we've been waiting since Elena Kagan testified that in 2019 they were seriously considering doing it, and they have yet to take action.
It's almost stunning that they haven't, to me. I don't want to ask you to speculate as to why not. Clearly, America's faith in their court on both sides, people identify as independent, Republican or Democrat, they're losing their faith in this institution. And something that is, I'm an X-generation guy, and maybe like many in my generation, we took for granted the rock-solid nature of our democratic ideals and principles until we started seeing them, very unprecedented things happening, including the Capitol being overrun for the second time in American history, not happening before since the War of 1812 and 1814. And so could you maybe at least explain this idea that the Supreme Court, maybe what the founders had in mind in terms of its urgency to self-govern, to do things that would protect itself from that kind of loss of confidence?
Yes, I mean, I think the framers of the Constitution realized how important it was to have a judiciary that was insulated, that its decisions were insulated from political pressure. But equally, the framers realized that they would want Congress to play a role in the establishment of the courts, the lower courts, which are the Congress's choice to create them, and the Supreme Court, which must exist but does not control most aspects of its administration, like its size, like the quorum requirements, like when it meets. Even significant aspects of its jurisdiction are controlled by Congress as the framers intended. And what they intended to do was have Congress ensure that the courts run effectively to serve the nation's interests. And that's what this legislation
would do. So the last point I want to make, which is something that again, in all my studies of the founding of our country, this worry about concentrations of power, this worry about the corruptibility of officials should they not have checks and balances. We have seen that writ large in our society in the other branches of government, how corruption happens. Because you get elected to the Supreme Court, you are not beyond the corrupting influences of our society, which are often revolving around enormous influences of wealth. And so could you just give me one more point on if we are going to hand on a democracy stronger than we inherited, or at least as secure, is there some wisdom to glean from the understanding the founders had about the fallibility of the people that hold these sacred offices?
Yes, the framers were very clear that there would be partial control of each branch over the other because no one should be unaccountable, and ambition must counteract ambition, as James Madison put it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Booker. Senator Hawley.